Well, just a trivial moment, personal privilege. I number my sermons. It's just how I file them. Today is my 200th sermon in Valparaiso, so here's the 200 more. That's not why I said that. I just find it interesting. But anyway, we're continuing on the series of Google questions, and just a little over 1 million times a month, someone asks this question on Google, and it's a heavy question. It's who is God? It's a loaded question. When I first put that in my schedule for sermons, I couldn't help but think back to my systematic theology class in seminary where Dr. Steve Long presented the classic ontological arguments for God. We read Anselm's of Canterbury's classic definition that God is a being greater than which cannot be conceived. God is a being greater than which cannot be conceived. If you can think of something greater than God, then surely that something would be God. Thomas Aquinas wrote that God is known through God's essence. He wrote a classic writing called Summa Theologica, and he states that the existence of God is self-evident, that God's essence is God's existence, and that God's existence is God's essence. To say God is, in Latin, that word is, can be translated as essence or existence. Is relates to the quiddity or essence of an object and whether or not it exists. And he uses an example here of a unicorn. You can also use Bugs Bunny as an example, but a unicorn's essence exists in that we can talk about the unicorn and know what it looks like. But it has essence only because it's mythical. The unicorn itself does not exist. And so the one that exists is greater. Okay, I'll stop. I already see it from here. Man. Primarily, I'm stopping there with the multiple syllable words because I realize that this question, who is God, is not ontological in nature. Okay, now I'll stop. But it occurs to me that this is not a question, who is God, that people ask on Google. It's not a question about God's existence, but of God's essence. The question here assumes God's existence. And I looked it up, that question, does God exist, doesn't even fall in the top 101 theological questions submitted on Google. And when we look in the Bible, we find the same thing. The first chapter, the first book, does not explain God's existence. It simply states that in the beginning, God created. There was not a beginning of God, but in the beginning, God is. Genesis 1:1 is said to be where faith begins. I couldn't find this where I read this or heard it, but somewhere along the way, somebody pointed out that if you believe Genesis 1:1, if you're comfortable with that, then everything that comes after it will make sense. who God is, how you talk about God, and how you talk to God will make all the difference, not only in your life, but in the life of those around you. God makes himself known to Moses at the burning bush. When Moses asks, "Whom should I say sent me?" God's response is he refers to himself as "I am." And for God to say "I am" is to say that God is the God of all time and space, that God is not limited by time or space. But when God refers to himself as "I am," he is speaking of himself in the present tense in a finished sentence. And what I mean there is, there's a period after "I am." There's not a continuation of those three periods of "I am" and "I'll tell you later." It's just simply "I am." It's a complete sentence that only God can say, because his existence is his essence. You know, the number one question that we ask about ourselves is who am I? Now, if you sat down and made a list of all of your personal attributes, it would get to be quite lengthy. And it's the same with God. The Blue Letter Bible lists 101 conspicuous attributes of God that is brought up in the Bible. And the most popular, the number one response, you probably know this. You want to take a guess? God is love. Yeah, you're right. The first attribute of God is love. And it goes on. God is spirit. God is the Holy One, the beginning and the end, almighty, creator, infinite, all-powerful, all-knowing, ever-present, unchangeable. God is everlasting, the author of creation and salvation. God is the Father of lights, full of power. God is calling right now. God is mighty to save. God is the door of the sheep. God is the way, the truth, and the life, the Prince of Peace, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the bread of life, Emmanuel, wonderful counselor, the great shepherd of the sheep, the same yesterday, today, and forever. God is our life, our Savior, our Redeemer, our teacher, our healer, our deliverer, our resurrection, our justification, our strength, our righteousness, our peace, our advocate. Are you beginning to get the idea? The thing is, we find all these same attributes in God's Son. So if you want to know who God is, get to know Jesus. We find in John 10, Jesus makes this connection, boldly makes this connection. The Jews are pressing in on him, asking about his own identity. Tell us plainly, who are you? Are you the Messiah or not? And Jesus responds with this outlandish statement: the Father and I are one. The Blue Letter Bible lists 101 attributes for God. And I didn't mention them all, but there's one missing. And it might surprise you. One that we find this existing in John 10 today. We find this in our story, the story that we're getting ready next month to explore. And this attribute is that God is rejected. The story of our rejection of God is the story of Lent. It's the story of Good Friday. It's the story that we often overlook. So many of our problems today can be traced back to this one attribute of God, that God is rejected. Jesus made this outlandish claim he's the only one who can make this claim. The Father and I are one. And starting in the next verse, the Jews turn around and look for stones to stone him, and he's gone. They want to crucify him right there and then for blasphemy. They reject him. When living in the midst of pain and suffering and confusion, when the cure is presented, very often it's rejected. I was the pastor for a couple missionaries many years ago. Bill and Cassie they went to Kafakumba for 3 years as missionaries. And they served with Ken Vance. Many of you know him. They came back to do some fundraising, and we got to know each other. Well, they decided after 3 years it was time to come back home to Kokomo. And actually, they had a small farm just down the road, maybe 3/4 of a mile. And when you live in the country, that's like next door. But Bill and I talked, and that was kind of a rough transition. He knew transitioning into Kafakumba was hard. Transitioning back into Kokomo, Indiana, that's not easy. And then one day he came in about 6 months after they moved back. He came in to see me, and he told me during this time he just felt something was missing. There was an emptiness within him, and he just couldn't quite put his finger on it. And he came in one day and he sat down and he said, something occurred to me today that I think this is it. And he said quite plainly, he said, it occurred to me that in America, I don't need God. So what do you mean? He said, every day in Kafakumba, we didn't know what we would encounter. We knew what we encountered, we just didn't know if we'd come home. Because right outside the back door, and he walked outside his back door and he looked out, and all of a sudden it hit him. I don't have to worry about that bed of poisonous snakes over here. We don't have to worry about malaria. We don't have to worry about being attacked for our faith or that people think we have money. Every day, that was a real part of our existence in Kafakumba. And so, yes, we left prepared. We needed God. But in America, we don't have to worry about any of that. Do we? I don't know if you saw this on the news this week. A young lady named Chesley Christ died last Sunday morning. She was Miss USA 2019. She was noted as the oldest winner of the Miss USA pageant. She also earned a law degree and an MBA, very impressive resume from Wake Forest. She worked as a correspondent for the news program Extra. Last Sunday morning, according to police, she jumped off a building in downtown Manhattan. Last year, she wrote an essay that was published in Allure magazine. And the title of this essay was A Pageant Queen Reflects on Turning 30. And here's what she wrote. She wrote, each time I say I'm turning 30, I cringe a little. Society has never been kind to those growing old, especially women. Occasional exceptions are made for some of the rich and a few of the famous, she wrote. But here's what she wrote. Turning 30 feels like a cold reminder that I'm running out of time to matter in society's eyes, and it's infuriating. Now, I did a Google search and tried to learn some more about this woman. What I couldn't find was, I can't speak to her religious beliefs or any claim on her church life. I can't make a claim on it. That's really not the purpose, but what I discovered was this article struck a chord for so many in our society today, for so many who describe their lives as empty. When people describe themselves, say, I am, a lot of people say, I am empty. And when those questions go unanswered, there's tragic results. If there was ever a time in our history when we need God and we need to share God, it's now. When Jesus said, "The Father and I are one," he was not making a philosophical or a metaphysical statement of their essence. He was speaking in the world of personal relationship. See, not everyone can understand what a phrase like unity of essence means, but we can all understand what a unity of heart means. Jesus had a unity of heart relationship with God that came from the attributes of perfect love and perfect obedience. Jesus was one with God because he loved and obeyed God perfectly. And he came into this world to make us what he is. And we're not always perfect in that. And that's okay. But every morning we get up and we go do it again. And the really good news is, there's really good news here. Because God is, we are. Because God is love, you are loved. Because God is the way and the truth and the life, you are forgiven. Because God is the bread of life, you are accepted and you are welcome. You remember last week I mentioned the three favorite phrases that people like. There was a survey conducted, and researchers found out that there are three top phrases that people love to hear repeated. You remember those phrases? The first choice didn't surprise anyone. That first phrase is, "I love you." That's a phrase that people like to hear repeated. The second phrase that people love to hear over and over again is, "I forgive you." And you remember that third phrase? If you heard this, anybody remember the third phrase? Supper's ready. Here's the really good news. God is. That's all we need to know. And because God is, you are loved. Because God is, you are forgiven. And because God is, you are welcome at the table of grace. And yes, we find ourselves in that strange time, but God has not stopped being God. And I have found, whether it's in person or through people participating online, the sharing of communion always has a deep meaning for people. I found this from the very beginning when we first started doing this online stuff, and there was nobody in the room, and there were just a few people here. I was a little skeptical at first. I didn't know if this was going to work, but guess what? I found out that I don't control what God does or doesn't do. That's not my job, but I'm just here to be obedient. And God said, "Go ahead, go have communion, because there's somebody participating in this online for whom needs to hear this today, and we need this today." We need to gather together in the body of Christ and be reminded that we are loved, that we are forgiven, and that we are welcome.